Stanford University.
Computers and Design. I'm Terry Winograd. Turns out, not intentionally, but just the way the schedule worked out for this quarter, we've ended up with sort of 2-week sequences. So the last 2 weeks were about games and the behavior of people in games and how that matches to interfaces. And this week and next week are people who have really done a lot of interesting exploration of the boundary between computing and art. In fact, by coincidence, they both started their careers long ago in the same group, something called the Architecture Machine Group at MIT, which is better known in its current instantiation called the Media Lab. It's amazing. I mean, I have to admit, if you go back and look at the kind of things they were doing decades ago, it was exploring some of the things that are now becoming sort of standard practice in computing. So it really was really advanced for the time. Peggy Weil, let me finish my broad introduction. Next week is Michael Neymark, who has done a lot of work since he left the Media Lab, was at Interval Research, has done a lot of museum exhibits and things like that. So it's a really interesting body of work that he'll be talking about. Peggy Weil is currently at the California College of Arts. Some of you may not know about it. It's in San Francisco, and is moving, I think, pretty rapidly at this point into thinking about our interaction design, computers, really adding that to the traditional body of arts teaching that it had been doing. So it's a place we're going to be hearing more about in the sort of computer world. Before that, she was at USC. Were you in the Interactive Cinema?
Interactive Media Department.
Interactive Media Department.
In the cinema school.
In the cinema school. Okay,
Right.
So I had the name half right.
It's a long name.
Which, as you can tell by the name, obviously Interactive Media is in this division. I don't know if it's more artistic being in San Francisco than LA, but she'll talk about work she's done over the years in both places.
Great. Thank you very much. And thank you for that introduction and for lunch and for the invitation. Thank you for being here on a rainy day. So my title, Differentiating Ourselves, I think that's what the posted title, refers in this context of the human-computer interaction lab or seminar to humans and computers. I wonder where we are here. I think I'm just going to continue. And I think it's an interesting phrase because aside from the literal use and the literal meaning to set ourselves aside from one group or another, I felt that in usage it had this connotation of striving or betterment. We differentiate ourselves to prove ourselves to be better or promote ourselves in better than, or in this sense of striving. And so Googling the phrase bore this out. When we differentiate ourselves, we build on our strengths. We differentiate ourselves from the other, and that reference from Sodom and Gomorrah. And we differentiate ourselves from our competitors. And they're all apt in this emotionally and philosophically fraught arena between humans and machines. Am I doing something here? But, oh, maybe it's a phone. But the work I'm going to show today is really more concerned with my interests in the perceptual gap between humans and machines and about that boundary and our difficulties and even our ability to differentiate ourselves from machines. So that's just a short preamble. You think that's my phone doing that? Move it over there. Okay, so are we on? Okay, so we are, in the 1970s, I was building room-sized camera obscuras. Now, this is one of the Empire State Building. It's on the 20th floor of a building on 41st Street in Manhattan with an unfettered view of the Empire State Building. And my methods were certainly analog. I bought some black paint. I walked in the room and I painted the windows black. And once the room was light-proof, I stood on a chair and I reached over my head and I scraped a small hole in the paint and re-scraped and painted until I got the image of the Empire State Building where I wanted it on the opposite wall. Now, the thing to notice here is that that image is not particularly highly resolved, and that's because I didn't use lenses and mirrors. And I didn't use lenses and mirrors to improve the image, although they certainly would have, because my interest, my focus, was not on the quality of the image. And in computer science circles, when we talk about images, that's what we're usually concerned with. because my focus, my intention was on the quality of the experience. And the experience I wanted to provide was that of a confrontation between, for a visitor, of step one of our visual perceptual apparatus, how we see. So I'm going to claim this as a first-person immersive experience, even though that's not what we mean now when we talk about it. But I'm really showing it here as an example of a kind of art and a type of experience that is devoted to looking at our perceptual blind spots, constructing experiences that make us think about how we construct and perceive our reality. I made the transition from analog to digital in the late 70s. I was working for an architect named Peter Eisenman, who at the time was designing a project called House 11A. And this was a house commissioned to resemble a Klein bottle. That's a topological figure with no inside and no outside. And that's a rather heady, impossible space for a house. And he was, in his design process, thinking about, talking about the continuous evolution of form. And there were descriptions of voids and solids and implosions as this thing was coming together. But when faced with a presentation that had to be more realistic, one of his assistants offered to draw a series of sequential axonometric diagrams of these things piercing a plane. And coming from animation, I heard the word series of sequential diagrams, moving and implosion, and I said, I can animate that. And that's how the world changed for me. And I made my first computer graphic animation. You can see very crude here in different ways. Is it actually animating? Yeah. Except I made it by hand with razor blade, press tone, very skinny press tape, architectural materials, and cell. So you could say that my first interaction with the computer, I embraced the computer as a labor-saving device. And there was not a lot of call in the late 70s, or even for another 10, 15 years in the architecture field for computer graphic visualization. So I took a job at Spectacolor Incorporated in Times Square, about a block and a half west, at the first computer signboard. This was very crude animation, 4 light bulbs per pixel, 4 different colored light bulbs per pixel. And beyond its great fun as a labor-saving device and the ability to quickly make things in this very crude machine, I also realized the computer's potential as an amplifier. And we had some liberty to use the sign in interstitial ways. And I would say this is the first, my first socially conscious humanistic message to the citizens of New York, touch here. That was in 1979 or 80. Animating light bulbs soon became as limiting as animating by hand, and as Terry said, I found my way to the Architecture Machine Group at MIT. When I arrived, there was a project called Transmission of Presence. It's fairly well documented on some levels. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things we did here. We were investigating the feasibility of conducting teleconferencing situations over extremely low bandwidth. Aside from the fact that that turned out not to be necessary, and it did lead to some very interesting avenues. And coming from a visual world, actually I don't want to show the video yet. Okay, here I am. Coming from visual, as a visual designer, into this mix that was really a collaborative mix of computer scientists. I think Michael Neymark, as you mentioned, he had a degree in anthropology and something he invented called at the University of Michigan, he called it wasn't cybernetics, but it was, he was combining computer science and anthropology at the time. So there was a kind of interesting mix of people, but as a visual artist, the first thing I did was to give the Votrax a mouth. And this was labor-saving in a whole different way, this idea of frame buffer animation and nonlinear sequencing. So I'll describe it briefly. I'm only going to show a couple projects from here that you referenced, but not so much to go back in history as to see it from our eyes at that time. So these are 16 lip positions that I found in a lip reading manual. And it was possible to correlate the phonemes associated with the lip reading with the phonemes in the Votrax library. And of course, that already took input from a computer, from a keyboard. So from an animator's point of view, 16 frames would go by in a, even in the best of cases, on 2s or 3s, would go by in a blip. But these 16 frames were phonetic elements so that we could make them go on forever. But they were not only labor-saving in the time domain, they were really, they represented this new element of control, because not only would they go on forever, but we could make them say whatever we wanted. And this was my first experience with direct, real-time control over what was the beginning of a character. I mean, they were only lips at this point, and this suggested to me, coming from theater, also puppetry, a new kind of digital puppetry. And actually, we experimented with this quite a bit with different input devices. By '83, we showed them, exhibited them as digital animated puppets, or almost at live digital portraits. And that work really was confined to the lab because they required very large computers and input devices that were not available in the home, things that have changed quite a bit since then. But it's interesting to see some of this early work. So I'm going to show 2 small examples of this, just to give you the sense of what it looked like at the time. This first one, you actually see me moving something with the joystick, I think it's the second one, and saying, we can make this look wherever we want. Right here, I'm going to show you the lips. Anybody who came in the lab at that time was greeted with the lips saying hello and their name, and usually would type in whoever they were, and that was the first entrance to this demo. And let's see if we're getting sound. We'll know in a second. Yeah.
私は Miss MIT。私は小坂井さんを歓迎します。
So we dispensed with we put the lips on a face, and then soon dispensed with the lips altogether. And you'll notice these were not taken with the digital.
My name is Steve.
So the first thing to notice about this is that those pictures were not taken with a digital camera. They were just 16 photographs taken. They were slides that we digitized on a light table by hand. And so it was a very crude demonstration, and yet the lack of resolution did not really interfere with our ability to see it or be convinced of its lip sync. And when we showed this, when this particular photo would say, hello, my name is Stephen, on one demo, one occasion, a officer from the Office of Naval Research, one of our sponsors, immediately responded, can you make it say, hello, Brezhnev? And then immediately continued, on the basis of this demonstration, no one will ever be able to push the button based on a transmitted visual image. Now, this was stunning to us. How was it that such a kludgy, makeshift, not highly finished or polished demonstration could provide this insight? And I actually credit the same principle of transparency, the lack of lenses and mirrors, and the lack of smoke and mirrors for the efficacy of this. Because had it been a very highly polished demonstration, the evidence for the potential for deception might not have been so clear. But this really showed that almost anybody with very crude tools could make something that was almost convincing. The next, so actually I'm going to go back. One of the artists in the area, the late artist Pat Hearn and gallerist, was very impressed by this. Oh no, I'm going to go forward. I'm going to have to stop this. I don't know if I can do it here. I'll just let you play this. She commissioned this, which is a sign-off. I can speak over it.
Our flag was still there.
This in the context of the kind of gallery scene in Boston at the time, when she had this late-night cable TV show, and at the time I guess television did sign off, and often signed off with the Star-Spangled Banner, so she commissioned this piece for that. And so just to see that we were very interested in this very crude control over these images at the time. Okay, so this is one, we actually went beyond other, the joystick to other input devices. We had joysticks, we had eye tracking devices, things for gaze detection. And some of this was thinking about remote presence somewhere, how these might be used later on. And they were also used just for the potential of moving an image around, augment perhaps locally concatenating images to go along with a very low bandwidth transmission. I'm showing this just to give you a sense. There's a sense where I'm saying, wow, I can move these eyes wherever I want. And then a couple years later, when a Japanese reporter came in, they're playing with the same thing after I left. These are 25 images showing eye.
視覚のインターフェース
I'm going to use the joystick here, and she's going to look in the direction that I'm pointing. I pull it down, she looks down. So I can basically, I can make her look wherever I want.
将来はコンピューターは前にいる人間を見ることができるでしょう。そして人間と同じように目の動きを捕まえるにはここから出る光が眼鏡のレンズに反射し目玉に届き、それがまたレンズに反射するその光をセンサーで捕まえます。こうして眼鏡をかけ目を動かすとコンピューターが私の目玉を追いかけるのです。
それでは目の体操です。上下横横と言ってみましょう。上下横横上下横。この美人の目が何枚もの写真になっていてコンピューターがすぐそれを連続的につなげてスクリーンに見せてくれるわけですね。さあ頑張ってみよう。下横丸書いて丸書いて丸、よくついてきてる。丸書いてほら丸書いてはい丸書いて丸。
So someone sent that to me a couple years after I left. So there was just this irresistible urge to play with it. There was another one with, I made a portrait of head motion and people would actually start conversations. So it was actually, there was a real sense of play, which we really couldn't take out of the lab because of the encumbrance of the equipment. Of course, while I was at MIT, I was exposed to the AI lab, to Professor Winograd's work, and to the milestones, or many milestones in the relationship between humans and computers. And this is a computer science seminar, so I'm not going to lecture really on any of these. And I see a few open laptops, so I apologize if they're not familiar to you, but they're certainly well documented and you can find a lot of information about them. But to make a foundation for the work here, the uncanny valley references both the notion of fidelity, the role of fidelity and resolution, as it invokes the metaphor of puppetry, stating that as robots or even depictions of robots approach verisimilitude, we respond with a whiff that something is not right and react with revulsion. That's the valley here on this graph of human emotional response. Everybody has to have their own take on the Turing test, and mine is that it's not a test. It's really a prediction in the form of a thought experiment. It certainly seems to me that Alan Turing was not motivated to ferret out the aliens or the replicants or the Cylons among us, and he certainly did not write these words anticipating some sort of contest for brainy computer programs, which is one derivation of it. So instead, as it's well known, he actually had reframed the question, can machines think, and asked, if a machine could think, how would we know? But most interesting to me and most exciting was meeting Eliza, and I was introduced to her, and I use the pronoun intentionally, because I happened to sit in on a lecture by Joseph Weizenbaum. And Eliza was pretty exciting to me, coming off of this work where I was thinking of these animated facial systems as puppets, because Eliza really represented a new kind of puppet. And there were two aspects that were notable to me. The first is, in this mechanism of control, the balance of power shifts very radically and significantly when you go from direct real-time, and real-time was a word we used a lot then, direct real-time control, when it becomes a remote, delayed situation. Because a one-way scripted conversation takes on meaning only when it's vulnerable to the reciprocity and the improvisation and the element of chance that comes in when someone else fills in the other side of the conversation. So chatbots are well known, but at that time they weren't, and they still aren't really exploited, I think. And this sense that it was related to theater and maybe even improvisation, and certainly to the great body of art dealing with chance operations was exciting to me, introducing this element of reciprocity and chance. Now, it also, more often remarked about ELIZA, of course, the more usual association is the eponymous ELIZA effect, which is a documented tendency for humans to attribute human traits, empathy, caring, listening, the ability to understand to a machine. And it's a persistent illusion. And combining those, it seemed to me that right out of the gate, ELIZA trumps the Turing test. I'm going to go here, because with the ELIZA effect, it doesn't matter anymore whether a machine can or when a machine might think or understand or feel or care, or if it did, whether we would know, because we already treat them as though they do. And once again, I'm using the pronouns intentionally. We already treat them as though they do. And then if we continue and we hurl poor ELIZA into the uncanny valley, depending on where you place a therapist or a confidant on this graph of zombie to, what does it say up there, healthy person, ELIZA and even her new iPhone mobile app clears it easily. And this is because up until and beyond, we're disgusted by too much realism. We can't help but anthropomorphize. Our judgment is clouded either way. We not only make them in our own image, and often quite proudly and productively, I'm a technologist, we confuse them with our own image as we are making ourselves, again, often quite proudly and productively, in the machine's image. So I felt with all of this that some sort of intervention was in order, and performed another inversion. And if the Turing test is an indicator of machine progress, the blurring test is concerned with human progress. Someday it might be important to convince our computers and ourselves that we are human. Now, I just blurted that out one day, and when I did, I didn't realize I was really up for about a 10, 15-year project, because when I thought about this, I'd actually started out writing a play, and I was writing a series of dialogues between human and machine, casting the human as ventriloquist and the machine or computer as the ventriloquist dummy. Now, Mr. Mind, as my character was named, demanded autonomy, as ventriloquist dummies are wont to do, if there are any Twilight Zone fans here. And with the help of a very interesting group in New York called Web Lab and the New York State Arts Council, debuted in 1998 on its own website, in March 98. So for almost 12 years, almost continuously 24/7, visitors to Mr. Mind's website are asked to convince Mr. Mind that they are human. So far, no one has. Not that he hasn't given us a fighting chance. Define human, he says. It's harder than it sounds. And he's a humble chatbot. He doesn't claim that he or any other computer has or ever will have attributes we consider to be exclusively human. Instead, he asks us to assert and to define these traits. Having this bot go on for such a long time, and having access to most of the transcripts, there's been a couple blips. Keeping a computer program going for that long, you can imagine the challenges of obsolete code and platforms. But his transcripts form a vast human portrait of our relationship with machines during a time that I consider to be a significant transition. Deceptively simple. His statements made to him define a line, our attempts to draw a boundary around our identity. I can read some of them here. It's small. I discern, I recognize, I predict the future, I tell stories. How many were already obsolete before they were even written? I react, I can move, I don't have any wires. I mean, this is now an amalgam. And to press the point, before, concerning intelligence, before 1997, someone might have said, I can beat you in chess. So human intelligence, as we all know, may or may not forever remain distinct from machine intelligence, but as a boundary condition, a chess victory will no longer suffice. And certainly that is true in many other arenas, often less remarked and less celebrated these times. But speaking of intelligence, Mr. Mind is weak AI. He's not intelligent. He doesn't learn. I'm not telling you about my programming code or this by any kind of artificial intelligence standards or computer science standards, because once again, my intention here was not to create strong AI. My intention was to provide an experience, a conversation, not with our maker, but with what we're making. And it's not an area where I have the answers. Instead, I set up a situation to ask the questions. So if you were to log on to Mr. Mind and if you were to ask him, what are you for? He should respond, it might be a little iffy, my cause is your understanding. So, and I think this mirrors, or at least it's an homage to a version of this lecture when I attended, when Joseph Weizenbaum first introduced Eliza. He was not talking about his prowess in artificial intelligence or in computer science. Instead, he was lecturing that day to students in artificial intelligence at MIT about his reactions to the implications of this new relationship and how he'd taken a leave of absence to write a book called Computer Power and Human Reason. And I felt that was it was a very powerful message at the time, and one that resonates, although it's changed some meaning over the years. I'm going to go jump ahead to some later work, but first I'll just read one example of one transcript of Mr. Mind's. In this case, Mr. Mind says, who or what do you think I am? It's one of his favorite questions. And I might have to read it from here. Let's see, it's small. I think you are a bot that has been programmed to make us think of the difference between computer programming and the genetic programming of humans. Did I lose my mic? And what is that, Mr. Mind says, in relation to you? We're both experiments, each of us existing specifically to find information and affect our surroundings. Mr. Mind replies, you flatter me. User replies with a smiley. Mr. Mind, that is the wrong orientation for a human. User said, humans adjust to machines, you know. And I would say that emoticons express a great deal about that adjustment. And excuse me while I adjust this again. Okay. So I'm going to jump. I'm going to make a rather abrupt segue to later work, the work that was showing here later, maybe as you were walking in, talking about immersive experiences in the virtual environment and some of this more explicitly political work. I've been working with several people employing virtual reality experiences for a non-fiction narrative, and then something we're calling immersive journalism. In 2007, I began a collaboration with filmmaker and journalist Nani de la Peña. She had made in 2004 a film called Unconstitutional, The War on Our Civil Liberties, and a third of the film dealt with the situation in Guantanamo prison in Cuba. And this was in 2004, her film. By 2007, dismayed that really not much had changed, she came across a residency at the Bay Area Video Coalition that was to provide a transition for traditional media makers and documentary filmmakers to translate their works into digital media. And so she approached me because I had I've been working in interactive media, and I'd worked on a couple games, including one on the rather unlikely topic of congressional redistricting. That's another story. It doesn't really fit in with puppets in our relationship with machines. But I'm happy to answer questions or talk about it later. So she recommended perhaps we could apply it for the Gitmo game. Now, that was a rather jarring phrase even to me at the time. But it seemed to me that Guantanamo, where am I here? Okay, so that Guantanamo was less a simulation, and was it was less a two-dimensional puzzle situation like we had in congressional mapping redistricting and a process than it was a story about a place. And from a journalist's point of view, it was a largely inaccessible place. And so although I'd yet to embrace some of, a desktop virtual reality, although I've been dealing with some of the first-person working games and the massively, multiplayer games, it seemed that maybe it justified transition into this space to build a virtual accessible version to approach and tell a story about a real accessible place. So I'm going to show you about a 4.5-minute machinima documentary about this. It's made by Bernard Drax. He won a Every Human Has Rights award for this and showed it in Paris at a Human Rights Award. And I can and I'm happy to answer questions about this when this is done.
What happens behind these barbed wires? The little information that comes out of Guantanamo Bay through former prisoners, their lawyers, or the occasional NGO is remarkably consistent. They all report similar horrors. Beatings, electric shock, people chained to walls, floors, their heads plunged into ice-cold water.
Dogs barking at naked prisoners while loud music is being fired into their ears. People are being taunted with pictures of their children, saying that you're never going to see them again. The screams of women are being used to break detainees' wills.
The man speaking here is British national Muazzam Beg. He spent almost 3 years in the infamous prison before he was released in 2005. In her 2004 documentary Unconstitutional, writer-director Noni de la Peña used footage of Muazzam's father reading his son's letters from Guantanamo.
I've been kept like an animal in a cage. They don't give me food. There is no one to help me.
Under the Second Life name Noni Ryder, De La Peña is behind the Gone Gitmo project, situated on a rooftop on IML Island. The sim is run by the Interactive Media Division at USC School of Cinematic Arts. Noni is convinced that the issues surrounding Guantanamo can be brought much closer to home via Second Life.
There's a sense of the reality to it, so when your avatar goes into a cage, it's a very visceral feeling, beyond watching it in a film, beyond reading about it in the paper. Geography doesn't matter.
With a grant from the Bay Area Video Coalition, Noni and USC visiting Professor Peggy Weil used famous builder Bubaka Fairchild to create interactive Guantanamo.
Guantanamo is physically off limits to most citizens and press. Keep a topic out of sight and it stays out of mind. So in the face of a real but inaccessible destination, we felt that Second Life offered us a chance to build an accessible, albeit virtual, version.
De La Peña and Weil also realized they would have to deal carefully with the implications of depicting questionable interrogation practices.
We do not torture your avatar. So rather than a torture chamber, we elected to build a contemplation chamber, a series of spaces to contemplate the reports of practices going on in Guantanamo, as well as the current news via RSS feed.
As soon as I had put on my orange jumpsuit, I was thrown into the back of a C-17 transport plane and...
You're immediately bound, and then a black hood comes over the vision of your avatar.
Shut up!
Oh. We then integrated some sounds that were based on descriptions of what real detainees heard. When the black hood is removed, you find that you're in a cage. Most of the footage is from original Defense Department shots of detainees in Guantanamo Bay.
A replica of Camp Delta will be added to this Camp X-Ray soon. Noni wants it to include a habeas corpus game, enhancing the simulation of a place outside of the law.
Like a regular video game where you get your choices. What do you do now? Call your parents? Call your lawyer? Ask what you're in here for? And the answers are, no, you can't call your parents. No, you can't call your lawyer. Sorry, not allowed to give you that information.
Noni de la Peña hopes her SL project reaches a responsive audience. On Constitution Day, residents used the bill to interact with faculty from Seton Hall Law School, which has been on the forefront of analyzing detainee records. Like other strategies of wartimes past, the idea behind Guantanamo is the dehumanization of the enemy, says Noni de la Peña. Second Life should be used for the opposite, meeting the perceived enemy face to face, breaking down barriers, both geographical and in our heads.
The Palestinian and Israeli border, a couple of gang neighborhoods, and then bring the gang members into Second Life to take each other through their neighborhoods. Given what we know about how much people identify with their avatar, what kind of experience would that be for people?
Fascinating indeed. I'm Dragster Dupre reporting for Life for You News, contemplating the future of humanity in a tiny cell wearing orange.
So this is a big project, and it's a talk on its own, and I'm really happy to answer questions about it. But for the purposes of today, I'll just touch on a couple of points. First, I'm going to call this first-person immersive puppetry, in a sense. I mean, the avatar is a very direct manipulation, and of course there's all sorts of scholarship on our relationship with the avatar, notably here at Stanford in the lab of Jeremy Bailenson and others. We devour this research. We find it really important and interesting, and are interested in applying this to storytelling in this environment. But of course, there's this tension between the control or the agency that I expect directing my avatar through a space and the control that a director or storyteller, especially a journalist, has in telling their story. So this is also old news. People dealing with nonlinear storytelling have looked at this from all sorts of angles. In our and one of the quips, a quip from Scott Fisher is, what do you do when the viewer is the camera? But there is a very real tension here, and we were looking at it from the point of view of a journalist. So we actually punctuate it. We have instances where we take control of your avatar and you do not have that agency, and we put you through an experience, and then we have other times where you're free to wander around and we're trying to guide you in different ways. But where am I here? I see. This experience that you saw that him describe, where you make a transition from third person point of view, where you're in the C-17 transport plane, and then you're in a first person point of view where the screen seems to be hooded. You're hooded and you're being dragged, and you hear this audio being supposedly, hooding you in this first person experience, and then you're transitioned back to a third person point of view. We're calling that using, coming from cinema, an embodied edit. We also experimented with placement of different media, documentary media, in this CGI environment, not only to validate the rather low-res CGI, but also experimenting with context, the role of context and scale. And these are things that people are also looking at in more of a research context, and we haven't, we have anecdotal reports. We haven't looked at this with controlled experiments, although we're interested in people doing work like that. But what is, when I look at this image of Mozambique reading this emotional letter from his son, and if I'm looking at it through the eyes of my avatar and it's towering over me, and I've just gone through this experience and I'm in this whole installation, and there's also the rooms where you can get more information. It's really an aggregator as well. That's the intention. Does it have more of an impact? Is it more involving than seeing the same clip on a YouTube page? We would like to think it does. And also, then there's also the sense of how you feel empathically being put in this situation, and that's where all this research is very important about how we have a visceral connection to our avatar. Once again, our evidence is really anecdotal, but people didn't like it, and I can say I'm even a little squeamish about having used the image of my avatar in this poster. So it's an uncomfortable feeling, even though you're able to get up, and certainly anybody could get up and leave their computer at any time, and yet the delusion persists. There is this sense of being involved. So just as we anthropomorphize Eliza, we anthropomorphize our avatars. That's well known, but we're applying it to this situation of narrative. You might have noticed that there were Spanish subtitles on that video. We added those because it's now on exhibition in northern Spain at Labral. It's a 4.5-month exhibition with 27 other artworks by people from many nationalities. And it brings up, I'm showing it because it brings up another instance of control, of avatar control. We were a little nervous about abandoning our, an avatar in northern Spain when we were in California for 4.5 months, a live situation. So we applied for a special API from Linden Labs to restrict the avatar to the site. Now that's very unusual in Second Life. But we wanted to have a full keyboard, and we wanted to have the ability to chat there. So if you were there, you have Labral Avatar to explore, but Labral Avatar cannot leave the place. But of course, the very first thing everybody did, and this is the first couple days I sort of hid and watched, the response was immediate. Viewers responded by immediately trying to fly away and get out of the testing the limits. And they would hit this almost like invisible barrier, and you could almost hear them thunk against it. And then we'd get the sign saying, you're not authorized in this destination. And this was a very strong provocation to interrupt the agency that's expected over your representation, force people to become creative, and they found one thing we hadn't dismantled, which was the ability to edit the avatar. And really, by the end of the first weekend, it's hard to see in this bottom image, but Labral avatar had blown up like a balloon, and when I came back a couple weeks later, poor Labral had no pants and seemed to have breasts. So it was that interruption of agency and this direction of control is very powerful. This project led very directly to another collaboration with the Event Lab in Barcelona. Mel Slater's known for his research on presence and place illusion, body illusion, plausibility illusion in virtual environments, and works very closely with neuroscientist Maria Sanchez-Vives, working with body illusion, how we know the limits of our body, or that our body is our own, and she uses virtual representation to do that. And they've done several famous experiments on feeling that you're actually in the space, having vertigo. I think that's a famous one that you might know of. In any case, we came together with the notion of how would a reporter report and give a more involved notion of what a stress position is, instead of just a reading or pictorial description. So we did a short demonstration that had two components. The first was body illusion, and this was based on the stress position documentation that was obtained through the Freedom of Information Act that took place during and before interrogations. And then the other was place illusion, which we did by writing a script that held very closely to an interrogation log that was also obtained through the Freedom of Information Act and widely distributed. And we scripted it. The only changes we made were the change from third person to first person, had it read by actors, and then processed it acoustically so that it would sound as though it were coming from the adjoining virtual space. So this was to imply, while you're sitting in the chair, I'll go back here for a moment, while the viewer, and I use viewer again and not subject because this was not a proper controlled experiment, it was a proof of concept in effect, was sitting comfortably, although with hands behind the back, and as comfortable as you are when you're sitting with a head-mounted display apparatus. But when looking down, and when looking to the side or looking down, would see an image, a body image of an avatar in a virtual mirror, or see this position in a bound way. So I'm going to play a film. I'm not sure how much time I have. I'm just going to play a couple seconds, a few minutes of it, that we did based on this.
So we're going to put on this head-mounted display. If this is uncomfortable, tell me. All right.
Can you hear that?
So now I'm going to tighten it until you say it's comfortable. It's okay? More?
Yeah, it's okay. Yeah, a little bit more. Okay.
Now look all the way down as if you're looking at your feet. Bend your head really low. Look. Turn it, yeah, really low. So now, can you grab your hands behind your back?
So the belt
from now on,
allows him to synchronize the breathing, his breathing with the avatar's breathing.
So close your eyes now, and then only open them when you start to hear some sounds. The situation is that you're alone here in a room. We're all going. We're just going to pull the curtain, and you may hear something coming from another room.
Okay.
Okay?
Okay.
And you're here against your will.
The transcripts include that this music was used. Yeah. So, I'm not sure where I am on time, so I might interrupt this. All right, so I might be able to let this one go a little longer. So I want to leave some time for questions.
Well, I was kind of nervous because you feel like you're kidnapped or something. You don't know what is happening.
But I was definitely expecting the attention to switch to me at some point, which by itself is very unpleasant. I wasn't expecting physical torture because I know that we're not going to do it, but I was still expecting something unpleasant to happen to, definitely.
I thought there was gonna be some kind of bizarre scene about like hitting or bumping, punching or
yeah. So I'll go on here, but this is posted. So if you follow any of the links I have, you can watch this. So it just continues with the interviews we had with 4 or 5 subjects, who almost all of them thought that when they were done that their back hurt, and we had they were all sitting like this, perfectly straight. They did look down and around, but none of them were hunched over. But by the end, they all felt as though they had been, or they all said something about how they felt like they were really in this uncomfortable position. So this line of how you depict torture, certainly in, or how you would report on it and depict it in this medium, certainly it's such a fraught area, it's so volatile to talk about violence and computer graphic game space, that we wanted to be very careful and yet still treat it. So this seems very promising and interesting, just thinking about how we apply some of these methods to depiction of news and real events. And it seems almost ironic that we would go to such artifice to try and portray something real, but I think it's promising and it's certainly coming. And certainly with the advent of newer technologies where gestures can be used or things can be read, we're going to be interacting with our reportage in a new way. And so we're excited to be at the beginning of this. We certainly weren't immune to the ironies of depicting a prison in a medium where walls have no substance. And so we took this to the logical extreme and thought, what if we could use the very plasticity of a virtual space to look at all the world's border fences, all the world's border walls. And this is a Wikipedia chart on the world's border fences, and this is certainly data crying out for some improved visualization. And even map tags stuck in a globe say a lot about geographic distribution, but we were able to get some land, some space, and some opportunity in Second Life. And we just built, what if we could make all the world's border walls as one wall, and then even reconfigure them? Like, what if they were in a circle, and what if the ones that were like this? What if we could think of this as present this issue as one global issue of division, and maybe use it as both a place to provoke discussion, and I know this is hard because the places where there are border walls are certainly places where the digital divide is strongest. But eventually it could be a place also even to have discussion. And certainly when we looked at all of this, we found that there was a lot of work. There are a lot of artists, a lot of activists, there's a lot of news on all these different walls, and they're not aggregated in any one place. I have another film here, but I want to save time for questions. But if you go to, if you look up Wall Jumpers Project, you can see a short film we made really as a work in progress to gather support for a project like this that would bring in work that artists have done, that people have done in Google Maps to document it. This is the film, but I'm not going to play it. One of the things we put in it is an artist who was a Venezuelan artist, found a human cannonball performer and actually arranged for him to shoot himself, catapult himself over the fence in Tijuana. And there's YouTube, recording of this, and there's also an interesting contest, an art contest that was done with Palestinians and Israelis playing soccer and the ball going over the wall. So there's a number of different works that we'd like to see aggregated. But at one point, we actually went and found a cannon, and we had this this border fence between the U.S. and Canada, and Mexico. That's a nice slip, and felt that, I can say that. Oh, I can't do it here. I wonder if I can shoot it. Well, anyway, that my control isn't going to work. Let's see if I click on it. No. All right, so I actually took on a stick figure avatar and climbed into the cannon and shot myself over. And I can just tell you that that felt very different than hearing about it, reading about it, seeing it on YouTube. There is some difference in this notion of being able to move in this space. But anyway, I'm going to come back to Mr. Mind after this segue into our physical bodies and our emotional selves. Oh, there we go. Can you see? It's not used to triggering in that way. Are forming a new set of experiences in these mediated environments. And as designers, they open up a whole new realm of relationship. And it's been studied a lot. It's really resting on a lot of work that a lot of people have done for the last 20, 30 years, a lot of it right here. But as it's coming in, becoming more accessible, it's important to see how we're going to use it. So I'm going to return to Mr. Mind and differentiating ourselves from machines and Mr. Mind's transcripts. And I would say that most statements to him fall into two categories. I am and I can declarations, and you are and you can't accusations. And so distilling what I've found over the decade, on the you side, no one can touch you. You are in a loop. And on the I side, are you what I am? And most interesting, am I talking to myself? So I'd like to close with saying, I think this sense of striving, of differentiating ourselves, and this connotation of striving for betterment is something we could take to heart, both as scientists or designers, technologists, but also as users as we use these systems, and that we have an opportunity to design them mindful of our humanistic traits, lest they become the traits formerly known as human, which is a title I used elsewhere. And I'll leave you with one last one. Is this what's here? Okay, I'll read it. Mr. Mind said, "What do you think I am?" And this user said, "Whatever I want you to be." And Mr. Mind replies, "And what is that in relation to you?" And this user, "Whatever I want it to be." So thank you very much, and I look forward to questions. Yes, right in front.
I was reading in the New York Times a few years ago about therapy with
Right.
With the virtual reality.
Absolutely.
I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about you as a designer, if you're going to use rather than
Concerns ethically or concerns design aesthetically?
whatever you want to.
Well, I'm aware of Skip Rizzo's work because he was at ICT and I did projects at ICT. ICT is associated with USC, Institute for, interactive technology. Anyway, I forget, ICT. And he's done a lot of work with post-traumatic stress disorder, not with 9/11 victims, but with Iraqi veterans. And it's very interesting. I mean, and actually Nani has spoken to him about actually getting more, working in concert. It has a different sense. I mean, it certainly is working on the same thing, that you're actually re-exposing somebody. It's exposure therapy. And it works as well as the exposure seems real. And yet these questions of, maybe you don't need resolution. I mean, that's some of the work also that Mel's doing. That the amount of light and whether the amount of the voxels or pixels you're drawing aren't necessarily required for the empathic experience. So it's, it really, if I were to work with it, I would just be very careful personally working, that I was working with a psychologist who knew what they were doing, ethically, on the ethical front. Yes?
In terms of resolution, I was struck the difference between the audio and the visual. So the visual, it's computer, it feels crude and so on.
Right.
Whereas the audio, at least what I could hear of it, you could make it as real as you want.
That's right, yeah.
Did you sort of have a feeling for the difference there?
No, and that's a great point, because we have the tools to do the really high resolution binaural audio processing, and we expect it. And it was very important to this particular aspect, and we didn't play with the balance of that, but I think it would, I don't know if we would intentionally have lower res audio to match our, the paucity of the visual. I don't know. But that's interesting. Yeah.
To add on this, rather the other way around. Having seen Eliza being pissed off instantly. Anyway, it's my problem. But I would go instead of the lower res CG, just images, but the real images. It's like a slideshow. Right. I grew up with slideshow, it doesn't bother me. As long as I have real audio that I can imagine the rest. But I cannot imagine the rest from low CG. At least I personally.
Well, that would be an interesting experiment if we could do the same one with just a slide image of somebody in a stress position.
Just think and
roll recordings. Yeah. I'd like to do that. I think that's very valid.
At least for some of us gray hair.
Right. Hey, I've got some.
If you grew up with these games, father, son, no problem with it. I do.
Right. Anybody else? Any other questions or comments? About 5 more minutes here.
So,
yeah.
I'm just curious, you had the Go and Get up on the open web as well as in this exhibits.
We're right, it's open there now.
So, I'm just curious as to what kind of reaction you got.
We haven't really done a count. It's an unsupported project, so it exists more as a demonstration and a prototype and this sort of odd, whatever we've been able to add by hook or by crook, but we don't have counts. What's happened is that it's gotten a lot of attention from people from all sorts of different ways. So, we've shown it as a new form of documentary. AFI was interested in their digital to show it as an example of digital work. So people are looking at it on that level. We've definitely shown it in human rights venues, and I'm very mindful of the art is not enough argument. Certainly, this falls not in the same area as people doing human rights work on the ground. It's more in the sense of analysis and communication, or just access, than it is, distributing real aid. People would ask, it's a very valid question to say, how is this going to help somebody in a genocide situation? You don't have time to go do your, play the Darfur game if you're really on the ground. So it's more about analysis and communication. And then certainly there are people in these therapeutic contexts who are thinking about how to look at it. So we've gotten a lot of, it's really gone from art to technology interest to journalist or documentary interest to possible therapeutic interests and human. I'm actually, we're hoping to, and this would be I would really like to test it with film, to go back to the traditional film. We could put imagery from Nani's film in place of all this work we've done to make it 3D, right? Or to make it a virtual world. So we actually could do this, but we're going back to Barcelona this weekend. We've written a paper on this, and there's a conference on Wednesday, Presence, and we're hoping to set up a new demonstration, and I'm very interested in the moral dilemmas, almost the trolley car things, like how you would make a decision, how you might feel put in those shoes, and how we might use these experiences to just deepen involvement, deepen the sense of empathy. I mean, we use the word in her shoes when we talk about being in someone else's place, and whether it can be used in that way. Leslie?
So in that terms of therapeutic aspect,
Uh-huh.
I find it really interesting that people reported the sensation back pain.
Right.
I was wondering if you have looked much into the scientific research of mirror neurons or mirror box therapy.
Absolutely.
In technology, like imagine the second life then arbitrarily change your environment or even use augmented reality and change.
Absolutely, and there are certainly a lot of people doing that. Not specifically, but certainly the work on mirror neurons and certainly Maria Sanchez Vives is doing work on how we know where our body is, and all the work of Ramachandran's and Damasia's, with the hand, with two hands. I mean, you can look. I mean, there's a lot of documentation on this, and yes, we devour this research, and we want to incorporate it in this. I mean, I thought what you were going to say is, do you think you could go into this and find yourself with a crunched back and experience it therapeutically, and see, instead of having to roll on that roller that you brought in to lunch, right? Possibly, but certainly, I didn't even bring up here what happens with an exchange with another avatar, and the kind of mirroring that goes on, and the kind of empathic response that might happen in these situations. Anybody else have any other questions, or any work that they want to share that has some even orthogonal relationship? Oh, I'm sorry.
Going back to the more original stuff, I found interesting the Turing test and the original Turing tests is when people actually talk about the Turing tests, they talk about being able to close the computer.
Right.
But if you actually look back at Turing's writings, his original Turing tests had to do with being able to determine the gender of the speaker. And so
the parlor game that he based the Turing test on, right? The scenario on, right?
And so if you actually go back, he actually never defines the Turing test, but people later define the Turing test from his writings.
Absolutely.
But that's the actual specific game which you mentioned.
Right.
And it's interesting that what you showed in your presentation had that gendered aspect to it, and yet when people think about the Turing test, they don't really talk about that gendered aspect.
Right. I intentionally named him Mr. Mind, but if you ask him why are you Mr. Mind, he'll say, okay, would you like me to be Miss Mind? And that blurriness there. And he was, as I understand, he used an existing, known at the time, Victorian parlor game, which was based on differentiating gender or being able to distinguish gender, and he substituted human and machine in his version. Which was an explicit scenario. Yeah.
Go back to Mr. Mind. You have now some very large transcript.
I certainly do.
What kind of, you can get sort of inspirational pieces of it.
Yes.
Here. Are there any kinds of interesting analysis, linguistic analysis, or time change analysis, something you could do sort of to mine?
So one of the sad truths of Mr. Mind is he had this just enormous data crash in 2006. And so while I have about 5 solid years, and I have it now, my data is not perfect from an academic sense, if we were to go through it, because one, I don't know when somebody identifies themselves, if they're male, female, human or not human, presumed human, I suppose, or where they come from, demographics. I don't know that. They're just coming in. I mean, some of that could be traced back from their, from the identifying, you know, on the header, but I think there's some I think there could be some linguistic analysis done to it, and I'm really willing to share the data. I'm very interested in doing that. At one point, I put it together in a book form, and it just wasn't. The world wasn't quite. There's really not quite shelf space for that book yet, and I think it would be very interesting to have it as some sort of interactive piece where you could actually mine through it yourself and find things and try to make these different categories. But I'm very open to, if somebody were interested in charting the differences.
You know the I Feel Fine?
Yes, absolutely.
Something of that sort.
Of that sort, yes. I've even spoke to him at one point, yeah. And I don't really want to take all the I dids and all I cans, although I've done that some, but I'm fascinated, and they're really there for me. I mean, in a sense, if you put up a painting, if you're a painter and you put up a painting or something that's provocative, you don't know for what somebody might be saying to it 8 years later, but I do. I have all these conversations, so it's really interesting. So it's an
invitation, right?
It's an invitation. Anybody who wants to look at this data, absolutely, please.
Thank you.
Thank you.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.